It's time to talk about the elephant in the room. Blitz orders. They're terrible. But why is that? In today's video, we're going to explore the design space of Blitz orders, discuss why they aren't played, and hypothesize about how we could fix them. Blitz orders were introduced at the very start of D Standard, in the very first line of products in fact, with Start Deck 4 Megumi. It had a single Blitz order, the only one of its kind at the time. Just like normal orders, you could play only one of these cards per turn. However, unlike normal orders, these orders would be played during the opponent's turn and would be used as a defensive card. From there, we would see at least one new Blitz order in every set until set 6. If we look at the rate of Blitz orders being released, there's a clear pattern of them starting off strong, then falling off hard, with us only getting one Blitz order in sets 5 and 6. The lyrical sets experience a similar pattern, with 3 Blitz orders in the first set, none in the second, and only 1 in the third. Between sets 5 and 6, we would see the release of the most impactful Blitz order to ever be released in the first 3D trial decks, Elementaria. This Sentinel Blitz became an automatic staple in every deck that could play it. From there, we wouldn't see any new Blitzes until the release of Festival Booster around set 10 meta and set 11, which made an attempt to push the order mechanic in general. Set 13 and Lyrical 4 also added a new suite of Blitz orders, which I usually refer to as the counter-place Blitz orders. In the new Divine Z era, we see Blitzes returning to main sets, and even an entire deck based around them. However, despite all of their support, barely any Blitz orders are ever actually played, and the ones that are either staples or completely generic. To isolate the flaws of Blitz orders, I've pinpointed 3 of the biggest things keeping Blitz orders from being played. These would be the lack of versatility, overcosting, and too much setup required. Okay, so this one is going to require the most explanation. Blitz orders are a defensive mechanic, so the direct comparison would be the other defensive cards available in Standard. This comes in the form of grade 1 and 2 normal units, as well as trigger units. Their defensive values range from 5k to 20k shield, with one 50k exception. Blitz orders, on the other hand, can cap out at around 30k shield, so from a purely numbers standpoint, Blitz orders are just clearly the better defensive mechanic, right? Your highest average unit shield value is 15k, and your limit to only running 16 in your deck. Unfortunately, while I said the cap is around 30k shield, this is really the exception and not the rule. It's hard to pin down the exact average shields of a Blitz order, as many of them vary, but it's safe to say at least most of them give 10k or 20k shield. Even at 10 and 20k shield, they still outclass most unit cards. So what makes them worse? In a word, versatility. While it's true that unit cards have less shield value on average, the fact of the matter is that unit cards are what help you win the game. Even a 4k trigger unit can deal the 6 damage and win the game, whereas no Blitz order will ever help you win. They can only keep you from losing. The simple fact of the matter is that unit cards are objectively better than Blitz orders. This is probably the smallest complaint, but I still think it's noteworthy. There are 3 Blitz orders that ask for 2 CB, one that costs 2 soul, and one that requires 4 soul blast. Most Blitzes aren't that bad though, typically being free or costing 1 soul or 1 CB. In theory, that's not really that big of a problem. However, most decks don't really have the extra resources to blow on these defensive cards. In every situation, you're probably better off using your resources for your offensive skills. After all, would you rather use 1 CB to get 10k shield, or to use a Leonore restand skill? If we add the resource-hungry Blitz orders to the fact that Countercharge and Soul Charge can be pretty limited for most decks and standards, we get a lot of cards that are generally not worth playing. And finally, we get to the biggest problem for Blitz orders, the fact that they require too much setup on the part of the player. You've got rearguard requirements, soul requirements, drop requirements, fucking if your opponent has moved your rearguard requirements. Your average Blitz order probably has just as many requirements as an entry-level job. We have so many Blitz orders with potentially high guard value, but if your opponent can just wipe your board or you haven't seen the right pieces, 40k shield turns into 0k shield. I wouldn't be much of a commentator if I just complained and offered no real solution. I did my best to try to come up with some possible solutions that keep the mechanic as it is, and simply design effects around it. I realize that a lot of people want the 1 Blitz per order turn to be removed, but I think Bushiroad has made it pretty clear they don't intend on doing that. So instead, I think that the other solution is to simply increase the power level of Blitz orders. So let's go ahead and get it over with so you all can yell at me in the comments. I think that if a Blitz order is to ever be playable, their shield value needs to exceed the shield potential of the average Vanguard deck. I don't think any Blitz order should ever be 5k shield. 10k might be fine as a baseline for more powerful effects, but if we ever actually want playable Blitz orders, I think the generic baseline should be at least 25k shield. This puts it above your average trigger of 15, but it also outclasses effect fronts and cats. In my opinion, there really isn't a problem power creeping these cards since Blitz orders are still only once per turn, and you can still guard with any number of triggers. One of the biggest advantages Blitz orders have is that they bypass guard restrict. Not many cards can stop Blitz orders, so they serve as good counters to any deck that uses guard restrict. However, a single Blitz order is rarely enough to counter most guard restriction attacks, so you'll most likely end up still playing into it. Shouldn't a counter card actually be enough on its own? Why do we have a card type that counters a game mechanic if it does a terrible job at countering it? I think the next thing we need to do to fix Blitz orders is to remove every single restriction. I'm speaking mostly about the many rearguard requirements. It just doesn't make sense for a card to ask you to do something that you can't control. What I mean by this is, while you can certainly decide how many rearguards to call, you have no way of ensuring that they will stay there during your opponent's turn. I guess as an example, let's take any of these Blitz orders. None of these cards can ever be used to guard Draguled Ignis attack or Gandiva battle phase. I know it's anecdotal, but my point is, what's the point of having high shield cards if you can't use them against the most threatening attacks? How can you ask players to play a card that can be good, but if you run into the wrong matchup, it becomes literally unusable? Look, I understand that all card games have some cards that are good into some matchups and bad into others. We're not talking about a card that just doesn't do a lot, we're talking about being physically unable to ever use that card. If a Blitz order is to have a requirement at all, it needs to be on the opponent and not the player. After all, Blitz orders are an act of desperation. Doesn't it make more sense that they become better when your opponent has your back against the wall and not when you're already beating them down? Personally, I think there's a lot of design space to be explored with this mindset. Blitz orders could be designed to already be good shield value, but the worse your situation is, the better they become. There are plenty of requirements we could impose on the opponent. Number of rear guards, number of attacks, critical, or triggers checked. Not only does this open better defensive options, but it also increases skill expression. Overextending could be punished by playing a powerful Blitz order, so players would need to take that into account when building their board and planning their attack. As we discussed before, a big problem with Blitz orders is the cost. I think that most Blitz orders should be free, at least ones at the current power level we have right now. The new Blitz orders from DZ Set 1 are heading in the right direction, costing energy instead of soul or CB. Energy as a mechanic is good for Blitz orders in general, as it forces the player to decide between using their energy for offense or for defense. Really, there's nothing wrong with adding cost to Blitz orders, but the cost really needs to match the effect. Say what you will, but 1 CB for 10k shield and retire a back row rearguard is just not appropriate. Discarding a card is fine for PG, but terrible to get maybe 30k shield if you're lucky. Another way to balance Blitz is to give them more than one effect. Just some ideals are to give them a cycling ability where you pay a cost and discard a card to get some effect like drawing a card. It's kind of a risk versus reward thing since you're sacrificing defensive power and converting it to offense. It seems like we might be heading in this direction if the new Regulus piece from Set 3 is anything to go by. It serves as both a standard Blitz order, but also has additional utility from the drop zone. I think that it's possible to learn from the past, and maybe take a few lessons from the past defensive mechanics. Of course, I'm talking about the well-loved G-Guardians. When introduced, they provided well-needed defensive creep, but also a plethora of unique effects that increase the complexity of the game. Now, I'm not saying we should get G-Guardians in Standard. I just think that some Blitz orders could potentially be as impactful as a good G-Guardian. Obviously, some of the effects are just too powerful for Standard right now, but I think small utility effects would be a good start. Maybe some revival or resource generation. Of course, these cards would be balanced with lower shield value, but also offer ways to advance your game state during your opponent's turn. Being a Blitz order also adds a level of balancing, as getting resources during your opponent's turn is much less impactful, since you have to wait until your next turn to use them. At the start, I said I didn't want to change any of the inherent game mechanics, but there is one thing that I would consider. That is, removing the grade restriction from Blitz orders. For normal and set orders, it makes sense. You allow for easy power scaling design. However, it doesn't really make as much sense for Blitz orders. Who cares if you can play a 25k shield on grade 2? It's still once per turn and still only blocks one attack. The grade restriction for normal units was removed quite a while ago, so doesn't it make sense to do the same for Blitz orders? Like I've said, I think that Blitz orders definitely have the potential to be viable cards. However, the current design for them and the game environment are not conducive to their playability. I offered my 2 cents, but I'm sure lots of people don't like my ideas, or maybe even have better ones. This is really more of a discussion and analysis, so obviously most of my ideas are untested. Anyways, that's it for the video. Do all those YouTube things, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.